Hi guys, in this video we're going to talk about the total mishandling of the pandemic in Brazil and the rise to power of Jair Bolsonaro. Brazil, land of samba, football, favelas and the Amazon, now in the news for all the wrong reasons. While Brazil is being crushed by the pandemic, Bolsonaro is coughing on his own supporters and calling for the military to step in to force people back to work. This coming from a man who has praised Brazil's military dictatorship. How could such a controversial leader rise to power in Brazil? And is it part of a wider shift towards authoritarianism? Most of the coverage of Brazil and Bolsonaro centers around simplistic comparisons to Trump. Bolsonaro is not Trump, and he didn't just come out of nowhere. A large part of the rise of Bolsonaro has to do with the failure of the left and corruption in the system. And that's what we'll get into in this video. So as we speak, cases in Brazil have surged to over 200,000, with over 14,000 deaths. And that's a gross underestimation. Yet none of this is a concern for Bolsonaro. In late March, state governors across Brazil began to implement social distancing and quarantines, and now 25 of the 27 states have implemented these measures. Meanwhile, Bolsonaro claimed that the virus was just a little flu and called the governor of Sao Paulo a lunatic for implementing these measures, accusing him of using the virus for political gain. Bolsonaro has justified all this by claiming that the economic impact will be worse than the virus itself. Now, it's true that 40% of the Brazilian workforce is in the informal sector, where people earn money day to day and cannot afford to be in lockdown. But for all his concern about the economy, the Brazilian stimulus package for informal sector workers consists of no more than 600 real per person per month for just 3 months, the equivalent of $102. Keep in mind that the minimum wage for Brazil is 1,000 real or $178, all while big businesses get their tax cuts. Then on April 16th, when his own health minister contradicted Bolsonaro and called for social distancing and quarantines, Bolsonaro promptly had him fired, despite the fact that over 73% of Brazilians support a lockdown and 88% believe that the virus is a serious threat. Unsurprisingly, over 76% of Brazilians think that the health minister is doing a good job, compared to just 33% for Bolsonaro. And just yesterday, May 15th, another health minister was forced to resign. Then on April 19th, he attended an anti-quarantine rally where people called for an end to social distancing, as well as the abolition of the Supreme Court and Congress and a return to military rule. And it was at this rally that he coughed on his own supporters. And this was not the only time that Bolsonaro showed flagrant disrespect for both social distancing rules and basic democratic norms. He called for the military to step in and force people back to work, and on May 12th, he issued a decree ordering the reopening of gyms and hair salons, despite Brazil being at the peak of the pandemic and new cases rising faster than ever. By flouting social distancing rules and contradicting medical science, Bolsonaro is putting people's lives in danger, especially the poor who live in overcrowded favelas. But this would not be possible without his media strategy. Bolsonaro has played a very clever game. He has continually demonized the media that is critical, calling them fake news and accusing them of creating hysteria. In fact, this has been so successful that some of his supporters have even attacked journalists in the streets. At the same time, he props up media outlets like Record TV, which is an evangelical Christian network, and SBT, which is mainly a lowbrow outlet. Now, both of these have downplayed the pandemic, with the owner of Record TV telling his viewers not to worry and calling the virus a tactic from Satan. Meanwhile, a TV presenter on SBT called for the creation of coronavirus concentration camps to put all the COVID-19 patients while everybody else goes back to work. These networks are very popular and allow Bolsonaro to spread his misinformation. The government of Brazil spends a lot of money advertising on TV networks. So what Bolsonaro does is direct government money away from networks he doesn't like Globo News, towards ones he does, like SBT. In other words, for journalists, it pays to be on Bolsonaro's side. But the virus is not the only scandal plaguing Bolsonaro's presidency. On April 24th, Bolsonaro fired his justice minister, Sergio Moro. Why? Well, because Sergio Moro exposed the fact that Bolsonaro had fired the head of Brazil's federal police, who was investigating his sons for embezzlement and disinformation. He then tried to replace the police chief with his friend, Alexandre Ramagem. Fortunately, the Supreme Court blocked him, and Bolsonaro is now under investigation for obstruction of justice. But this shady business has left Bolsonaro with few allies, and calls for his impeachment have become louder. In fact, up to 54% of Brazilians want him impeached, with only 37% against. So you've got a president who's in denial about coronavirus, who wants to return to military rule, and fires the people who are investigating him. Unsurprisingly, his approval ratings have imploded, from over 57% when he got elected to just 39% today, and even 30% in another poll. But let's not forget that this man was elected democratically, with 55% of the vote. To fully understand all this, we need to go back and understand how Bolsonaro was able to rise to power. So between 1964 and 1985, Brazil was ruled by a right-wing military dictatorship. That dictatorship was justified by the need to purge the country of an internal enemy, leftists, and maintain traditional Western values. And this was achieved by the mass torture of dissidents. People were subjected to electric shock treatment, had insects introduced into their bodies, and some were even crucified. But unlike in other countries, after the dictatorship, the military leaders were never properly punished or exposed for their crimes. So there's a prevailing myth among many who didn't directly experience torture or are too young to remember, that this was a time of law and order and peace and prosperity. And it's this myth that people like Bolsonaro exploit. Rather than condemning the dictatorship, Bolsonaro said it didn't go far enough.
Através do voto, você não vai mudar nada nesse país. Nada, absolutamente nada. Você só vai mudar, infelizmente, quando um dia nós partimos para uma guerra civil aqui dentro. E fazendo um trabalho que o regime militar não fez. Matamos 30 mil. Começando com o FHC. Não deixar para fora, não. Matando. Se vai morrer alguns inocentes...
Now, after the dictatorship, Brazil returned to democracy, and from 2002 till 2016, Brazilian politics was dominated by the left-wing PT, or Workers' Party. So before we get into the dark side of the PT, it's worth mentioning that during the rule of the Workers' Party, some pretty decent policies were put into place. Brazil is a massively unequal society, but the 2000s saw some of the highest rates of economic growth for Brazil, and the Workers' Party made sure that the growth benefited the poor. 23 million people were lifted out of poverty, and 15.3 million jobs were created. And this was achieved in part through redistributive social welfare programs like Bolsa Familia. And these programs were very effective at reducing poverty and inequality and improving education, not just according to left-wing blogs, but academic economic studies. And this made the Workers' Party massively popular, winning 4 elections in a row. First 2 terms under Lula da Silva, and then 2 more under Dilma Rousseff. But in 2014, everything changed, when Brazil was engulfed by the largest corruption scandal in Brazilian history, Lava Jato, Operation Car Wash. In this scandal, it was uncovered that officials in the state-owned oil company Petrobras had accepted bribes from business people in exchange for overpriced contracts. But this corruption scandal soon grew to implicate hundreds of politicians and business people from across the political spectrum, including 3 former presidents. Over 429 people were indicted and 159 were convicted, and billions of dollars were stolen from the Brazilian people. Separate from Operation Car Wash, President Dilma Rousseff was found guilty of illegally manipulating the government budget, and for this, she was impeached and replaced by her center-right vice president, Michel Temer. But as it turns out, he was later found guilty of leading an organized crime ring that accepted $470 million in bribes. And as this political crisis unfolded, every political party and politician was being discredited. This unprecedented corruption crisis led to a wave of protests and a surge of discontent with the political establishment. But it wasn't the only crisis Brazil was facing. Since 2013, the economy had slipped into a recession, and the country was engulfed in crime. In 2017, Brazil experienced over 64,000 murders, almost 4 times higher than the United States, and one of the highest murder rates in the world. For many people, the country seemed lawless, corrupt, and out of control, and it needed a strong leader to fix it. And out of this crisis came a hero, Congressman Jair Bolsonaro. He had been a politician on the fringes of Brazilian politics, but that suddenly became a bonus because it made him an anti-establishment outsider. He promised to restore law and order to the country. When it came to crime, he proposed that the police should just be allowed to execute criminals on the spot, without trial. This in a country where even before Bolsonaro, extrajudicial killings by the police were not uncommon. Now, of course, authoritarian measures like these extrajudicial killings also mean that the police are totally unaccountable and innocent people get killed, and it usually makes the violence worse. But in a country with 64,000 murders a year, that lands. Because of this triple crisis, people had a deep distrust of democratic institutions, with support for democracy falling from 54% in 2015 to just 32% in 2016. So when Bolsonaro says something like this,
Eu não confio na democracia brasileira. Isso que está aqui não é democracia, isso aqui é uma bagunça. Tanto é que a população diz abertamente que se vivia muito melhor no regime militar.
it resonates. But the only thing that stood in Bolsonaro's way was the Popular Workers' Party leader, former President Lula da Silva, who was running again and was leading in the polls. But then in 2018, as part of Operation Car Wash, he was convicted on corruption charges and barred from running for office. And this forced the PT at the last minute to nominate the unknown Fernando Haddad as their candidate. This anti-corruption crusade was led by popular judge Sergio Moro. Remember that guy that Bolsonaro just fired? But even he wasn't as clean as it seems. You see, after the election, leaked chats published by The Intercept revealed Sergio Moro, as a judge, and remember, judges have to be neutral, had secretly collaborated with the prosecutors and given strategic advice on how to convict Lula da Silva on corruption charges. Now, this is not about defending the Workers' Party or apologizing for corruption just because it comes from the left. That's not what I stand for, and that's not what the left should stand for. But rather, it's about making sure that anti-corruption efforts are applied equally across the board and not for political purposes. And these leaks show that Operation Car Wash was in part targeted at Lula to prevent a Workers' Party victory. And that's exactly what happened. With Lula out of the picture, Bolsonaro was propelled to victory with 55% of the vote. So Bolsonaro's coalition was composed of 4 groups. Bolsonaro's tough message on gays, law and order, and a return to so-called traditional values got him the conservative evangelical Christian vote. His choice of radical free market economist Paulo Guedes as finance minister got him the support of the business class, who would rather have Bolsonaro than more redistribution with the Workers' Party. He then chose Sergio Moro as his justice minister to get the anti-corruption vote, and to get the support of the military. Besides just praising the era of military rule, Bolsonaro nominated 7 military commanders to his cabinet and appointed military general Antonio Murao as his vice president. But Bolsonaro has been massively polarizing. To begin with, he was actually stabbed just before the election. And he has abolished the Ministry of Labor, dismantled environmental protections, and threatens indigenous people's rights. This is a man who has open disdain for democracy and longs for a military takeover of the country. And in a country where trust in democratic institutions is low, but trust in the military is high, this is a dangerous combination. The pandemic, however, has made Bolsonaro weaker. The business class no longer supports him because the economy is in shambles. The anti-corruption crowd left when Sergio Moro was fired. And although Bolsonaro supporters are calling for a military takeover, the military has come out against that notion. But it still leaves Bolsonaro with a hardcore conservative base of support among evangelical Christians. There's a lesson here for all of us. When democracy fails in the eyes of the people, anything, even authoritarianism, looks better. And that's dangerous. Special thanks to our Patreons who made this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.